Way, amicus. Do you enjoy immersion? Do you appreciate world design? Are you a fan of environmental storytelling? If you answered yes to any of the above, have I got the town for you? It's my pleasure to introduce the town of Modoc from Fallout 2. This is hands down my favorite town in all of Fallout. I specify town because New Reno is obviously the best city in Fallout, but on the smaller scale of towns in the post-apocalypse, Modoc takes the prize easily. As the standard and execution of Fallout's towns has plummeted with each new title, I can only expect Fallout 5's communities to continue this trend. In the hope to show Fallout players the standard a town can achieve, I will be exhaustively covering the town of Modoc in its entirety. Hopefully, at the end of this video, you'll not only want to go play Fallout 2, but your expectations for what a town in Fallout can and should be will be fundamentally changed. We shouldn't expect just all right, or overlook poor writing and world design because that's the current standard. The earlier titles had amazing locations like Modoc. I don't know about you, but I'd rather be disappointed by Fallout 5 than lower my standards until I can accept mediocrity as quality. This town encapsulates the very best that Fallout can achieve. Sit back, amicus, and I will tell you why. Upon entering Modoc, we are greeted with the bleak color palette of an arid scrap town. The Pip-Boy display says, "A small, quaint farming community, surrounded by vast fields of dead or dying crops." Unlike most civilizations in the early games, this town has no walls or notable defenses. It is laid out in the open, like a classic western town of shacks and livestock pens, surrounded by dry fields of crops. The aesthetic of this town is phenomenal. The dusty beige landscape, the rusty sheet metal houses, the boarded up well in the center of town, serving as a monument to their current struggle, the random junk, barrels, and tires scattered throughout. This town appears like a typical inconspicuous little village, except for the patches of noxious biological goo in random places. But don't worry, that'll come up again later. If we speak to the locals, we are told about this town's plight. They are experiencing a harsh drought. The wet season was too short this year, and their only well has gone dry. As a result, crops are not growing at a sustainable rate. The people here have begun to struggle. They rely on caravans for many of their daily needs. Their main exports are leather and crops, but the drought has ruined their economy. Without the means to produce goods to sell, they are running out of time and options. This town has several notable locations for the player to discover. If the player speaks with Joe at the trading post, he can give us a basic rundown of notable things to be found in this town. The main attractions for Modoc are the bed and breakfast, the slaughterhouse, the tannery, the town church, and the trading post. Each of these offers unique and interesting options for the player. Let's look at each of these locations in, let's say, alphabetical order for no particular reason. Let's start with Rose's Bed and Breakfast. Rose's Bed and Breakfast is one of the more well-known locations from the older Fallout games. The Fallout famous omelets can be found here. The player can be told that travelers come from all over the wasteland to try Rose's famous omelets. But what could make these eggs so succulent, you may ask? Well, to the left of Rose's Bed and Breakfast, the player can find a well-fortified shack. Calling it fortified is an understatement. This building has sturdy walls, reinforced with wooden supports. Several guard dogs will attack the player once inside the tall barbed wire fence. Since the older Fallout titles gave the player a variety of options to solve most problems, these hounds can actually be distracted by throwing some meat jerky on the ground. Said jerky can be bought in town from the Slaughterhouse. In addition to the barbed wire fence and the dogs, the only entrance to the shack is blocked by a pile of large rocks. If we speak to the butcher's daughter, she will make a foreboding comment that it appears Rose is trying to keep something from escaping rather than keeping predators out. Sure enough, there's no chicken in this coop. If the player uses dynamite or another explosive to clear the doorway, we can enter the shack. Inside is a primordial creature of hell and radiation, a deathclaw. This town's most famous omelets are deathclaw eggs. The deathclaw no doubt blames us for having her babies regularly stolen. It will be instantly hostile, and adds one more tally on our kill count. If you speak with Rose afterward, she will comment on how somebody broke into her shed and killed her chicken. This location is one of my favorites in all of Fallout. Here the player can purchase a variety of meals that each heal the player to a different degree. The meals are all undesirable post-apocalypse food, but the names are designed to make the bleak food sound more enticing. Inside this bed and breakfast, the player can meet Rose's husband, Cornelius. He can inform us that his watch is missing. The player can offer to locate his watch for him. He suspects his lifelong best friend, Farrell, is the culprit. The player can go around town inquiring about the watch's whereabouts. Word travels fast in this town, and almost everybody already knows his watch is missing. Farrell rightly takes offense that he is suspected of stealing his best friend's watch. The clerk at the trader, Joe, will be very defensive if the player asks him about the watch as well. You might suspect Joe because of his reaction, but the truth is so much better. If the player heads to the outhouse, we can actually lift the seat and climb on down the shitter. Once down here, the pit-boy will inform us that the air is thick with gas from the decomposing feces. The cave underneath the town has blocked off any way for the gas to escape, and so it has pooled here, festering. If the player fires their gun or sets off an explosive, it could be very dangerous. We, of course, do just that. The player can set the fuse on a piece of dynamite and escape up the ladder before it explodes. If you've timed it correctly, the gas will ignite and the outhouse will explode. Remember that strange goo we noticed in the town prior? That would be the shit and refuse from underneath the town. Let's take a moment to appreciate how long it must have taken to make this goo cover the town. This game is old. Everything had to be handcrafted. Creating different versions of the town with and without this glossy goo is quite impressive. It goes to show the level of care that was put into a seemingly insignificant town like this. If the player returns down the outhouse hole again, we can find a pathway has been cleared for us. The explosion from our dynamite in the gas-filled chamber caused a large enough explosion to clear the rubble. If we follow this path, we can find several interesting items. One of these is Cornelius's gold watch, probably fell off when he wiped his ass. In RPG fashion, the player has a few choices for how they want to proceed. We can give the watch to Farrell. He will take it to Cornelius to clear his name and reconcile their friendship. Or we can take the watch to Cornelius and tell him where we found it, for a suitable reward for our hard work. Alternatively, we can give the watch to Cornelius and lie about where we found it, casting blame on his friend Farrell. If the player chooses this option, Cornelius will confront Farrell, a dynamic and satisfying ending to a quest. There was an actual search for an object, not just following a quest marker. The game actually gives us subtle clues to guide us to the watch. Cornelius will mention that he cleans the outhouse regularly. With some critical thinking, players can infer that the watch likely fell off while he was leaning down the john to clean it. There was a story to this quest as well, not just an excuse for the player to go fetch something insubstantial. Two lifelong friends driven apart by suspicion, and there was a resolution to this quest, dependent on the choices of the player. Not just a simple fetch, return, thank you, here's 100 caps, but a resolution that changes the state of the town in which it happened. The player had an impact on the people around them. Now that the mystery of the noxious biological goo has been solved, let's proceed with the rest of the town. Next, let's look at the Slaughterhouse. One business that is not suffering during this drought is the butcher, Grisham's Slaughterhouse. Having less water means he will be unable to keep as many Brahmin properly sustained. Given the lack of food available, he can raise the price of beef as high as he wants and people will buy it. See Bethesda. Fallout 2 devs understood economics. Exclusivity equals unrivaled price gouging. The butcher is doing fine because everybody is in need of food during this drought. And with the excess Brahmin he can no longer keep hydrated, he can kill and supply the town with enough food. This solves his Brahmin's water problem while making him more money than before. The world building is flawless here. The environmental storytelling creates a believable and realistic setting for a post-apocalyptic town. While on the topic of Grisham, let's discuss his incestuous whore children. Davin and Maria can be found inside the butcher's house. The player can sleep with either of these NPCs through some dialogue lines. If the player chooses the dialogue carefully, you can even marry one of the two. You probably didn't know this, but Fallout 2 was the first, and yes, I mean the first, game to have gay marriage in video games. The player, regardless of their sex, can marry either the son or the daughter. The scene where this takes place was crafted with such care it is truly a pleasure to witness. The shotgun wedding, in the literal sense, and the NPC being pushed onto the player as a follower immediately after their father catches us sleeping with them. It's a very nice detail, and it's always something worth doing while you're in town. If you play an evil karma character, it's also an easy way to make money early. Run to Modoc. Marry Maria. Run to the den. Wasteland merchants hate this one simple trick. Just sell your wife into slavery. Boom. Easy money. Careful returning to Modoc, however. If you speak with Grisham after selling one of his children, he will have a heart attack and die. At any time before Grisham's death, the player is offered a job to guard his cattle. This is the closest to a Radiant quest the early entries ever get. It's just a simple job, requiring us to spend the night in a pasture full of Brahmin. The Brahmin will be attacked by a pack of wolves. The player's pay at the end of the job is dependent on how many Brahmin die. This is a good quest to earn a few caps and a bit of experience. Nothing crazy, just guarding a man's cattle for him. Not random raiders across the map, or an insignificant object at the bottom of a dungeon. Just a bit of combat for hire, in a location and in a context that makes sense for this town. Moving on. Next, let's look at the tannery. The next attraction in this town is the tannery, using the Brahmin's hides to make leather, and then leather goods from it. If the player has 6 perception, they are able to unlock unique dialogue with Balthus, the tanner. With a high perception, the player is able to notice that he seems distraught about something. First of all, what an excellent use of the special system. You might know this quest is here beforehand, but if your character is not perceptive enough, you won't have the option. This is a great example of the in-depth role-playing in a Fallout game. The choices you make when deciding your special stats are a major part of being able to roleplay your character. Is your character a perceptive person, able to notice things others simply wouldn't? That's a choice you can make for your player when deciding what points to allocate on your special stats. Moving on. If we press him about his emotional state, he will share with us that his son is missing. They have looked for him, but he hasn't turned up. The player can offer to investigate and keep an eye out for their son, Johnny. To help us in this investigation, the Tanner Balthus dog, Laddie, will follow the player. We essentially have another dog meat for the duration of our investigation. You might not have expected this to be an in-depth investigation, but the earlier titles might surprise you with how well they can tell a story through objects and the environment. For example, if we clear the boards from the well and then use a rope to travel to the bottom, we can discover something interesting. Johnny's BB gun is at the bottom of the well, right next to a cave-in. From this, the player could surmise that Johnny fell down the well and died in the cave. Probably in the cave-in, since we don't see a body. We can take his BB gun back to his parents and give them the sad news. They will thank us for our investigation, while remaining heartbroken. Next, let's look at the church in town. Well, that's about all there is to it. It's used for weddings and nothing else. Joe will tell us that since the drought, people don't have much to be thankful for, so they don't go to the sermons anymore. That's fine. Not every location needs to be an in-depth quest or have a hidden story. The plethora of quests and storytelling from this town more than makes up for a one-time use of a church. I will point out that the architecture for this church is great. It looks similar to the buildings we find in the original Shady Sands, and it stands out distinctly from the other buildings in town. I guess if the player needs to ask for forgiveness before the next events, then it does serve more than one use. Moving on. The last major location in Modoc is the town Trader. I've saved this location for last because it is the start of the town's major quest. You know, Dawnstar had the Nightmare quest, Goodneighbor has the Dig quest, and Modoc has the Slag quest. If we ask Joe about the Holy Gek, he will tell us he knows where to find it. For payment, he asks us to help him solve the town's drought problem. The drought means this town does not have enough food. Joe tells us that recently an entire farm appeared to the north, with crops and livestock, but nobody around to tend it. They sent men to the farm to try and establish friendly relations, but the prosperous farm appeared empty. Due to the drought, they couldn't let this vital resource go to waste, so a man from Modoc named Carl moved into the farm. Unfortunately, he didn't stay for long. Carl would tell the people of Modoc that glowing ghosts would emerge at night to tend the crops and care for the livestock. He was terrified and asked the town to help him. They laughed at him and denied the existence of these paranormal entities. But then Carl disappeared. When several members of the town traveled to the farm to investigate, they were met with a horrifying sight. Dead bodies. Some crucified, some left to bake in the sun, all horribly mutilated. The men were so terrified that they fled the farm and never returned. But now, with the drought's continued effect on the town, they are desperate for the resources from that farm. Joe asks the player to go there and investigate. Here we can find one of my favorite charisma dialogues in the early games. Having high charisma is different in the older Fallouts. Similar to Fallout New Vegas, having different stats gives the player unique dialogue options that you'd never know existed without the right stats. We can ask Joe for a test of his trust and conviction. We demand that he cuts off his right pinky finger to seal the deal for our help with the ghost farm. He will be hesitant, of course, but through persistence, we can actually have a man cut off his own pinky to prove he is desperate for our help. He even justifies it as a small price to pay to save the town from the effects of the drought. Remember when charisma checks were for interesting and immersive dialogue, not just the yellow, orange, red for more caps? Anyway, the player will now be able to travel to a location northeast of Modoc called Ghost Farm. When the player arrives, we find the farm just as Joe said. Many bodies are strung up and dismembered along the farm's perimeter. However, if the player inspects these corpses, we can learn something very interesting. They are all fake. These are simply piles of hay, stuffed into clothing, covered in Brahmin guts, and strung up to appear like corpses. The men of Modoc clearly kept their distance at the site. Continuing through the farm, we see it is, in sharp contrast to Modoc's farms, very prosperous. These fields are massive and healthy. This is just what the town of Modoc needs to survive. If we step into the building in the middle, we find a few footlockers ahead of us. We obviously approach the loot, but fall into a trap. There's a giant hole in the floor. We fall for the Looney Tunes-ass trap and regain our composure in a cave. There are, in fact, people here. They demand that we speak to their leader. We have no choice. The player is taken to their leader, Vagar. Now, allow me to embellish on how well written this next bit is. Vagar is the leader of the slags. He will ask us to take a message to the townsfolk of Modoc. The writing and environmental storytelling for this group is absolutely flawless. These are the slags. From Vagar we can learn their backstory. They were a community of people living here before the bombs fell, a militia of sorts. From the looks of it, they were a country bumpkin militia doomsday preppers. When the bombs fell, they retreated to their bunkers and their resources. The families survived in their subterranean community for many years. If we look around, we can see how. There is an underground spring on one side. They have a water pump connected to it. They've been able to domesticate the massive rodents we encounter throughout the world. They can also grow mushrooms and fungus underground for more food. Eventually, they returned to the surface. But generations of living underground had adverse effects on them. Their bodies adapted to the dark caves, and now they cannot go in the sun. It is too bright for their eyes and too harsh for their skin. So, they only tend to the farm at night when the sun isn't an issue. Some time ago, a man moved into their farm and began stealing their crops and livestock. This was the aforementioned Carl from Modoc. They made the decision to rid him from their farm. They did this by covering themselves in glowing fungus and beginning to tend the farm at night once again. Poor Carl really did see what he believed to be ghosts. He was terrified by the ghosts. Paired with the fact that nobody in Modoc believed him, he fled the area altogether. The slags then erected the decoy corpses to ward off anyone else. Recently, their farm has been immensely profitable. Vagar tells us it is in part due to their new irrigation system. This is in stark contrast to the farms we see in Modoc, suffering from a drought. The slags have surplus food, but not nearly enough medicine. Vagar is meaning to reach out to the town of Modoc to trade food for medical supplies. But due to the past events with Carl, nobody has come to the farm in order to make this deal. The sun prevents them from traveling to Modoc themselves, so he gives the player a message to return to the townspeople with. Fantastic writing and environmental storytelling. The contrast between the slags and Modoc is such a great example of how to write conflict. Two groups, each trying to do the same thing in their own way. They each have what the other needs, but through circumstances, they are almost at odds with each other. Before we return to Modoc, there is something else here for the player to find. Little Johnny is in fact not dead. We can find him playing with a group of children near the water pump. The BB gun in the well was a red herring. Johnny got lost and was discovered by the slags. The slags, being genuinely good people, took him in as one of their own. Better than leaving a child in the wastes to be found by a rad scorpion or worse. He has remained here and been cared for just like the slag's own children. If the player speaks to Johnny, we can inform him that his parents are looking for him. He will be suspicious. Good. Stranger danger. Johnny was raised right. He will ask that we tell him the name of his father before he believes us. Here's a test for your memory. Which is it? Time's up. The answer is Balthus. If we answer correctly, he will ask to be returned home to his parents. Vagar will refuse unless we have made peace with the town of Modoc. Smart man, Vagar. Keeping Johnny with the slags, not as a bargaining chip, but out of concern for the child's safety and well-being. Both the slags and the population of Modoc are shown to be kind, hard-working people, trying to make the most of their situations. This plays into the choice the player makes next. How will we proceed with the slag's offer? The player has a choice to make. We can return to Joe and lie about the slags. We don't tell him the corpses are fake. We instead tell him there is a dangerous community living at the ghost farm. We need to wipe them out before they can do the same to us. If the player has met Johnny, we can use this to our evil advantage, telling Joe that the slags have Johnny captive to demonize them even more. If the player chooses this option, then the following battle will ensue. The townsfolk of Modoc will form an angry mob and attack Ghost Farm at night. The slags will defend themselves, but be overwhelmed by the superior force of the townspeople. It's a massacre. We orchestrate a mini genocide of the slags. After the battle, we can talk again to the NPCs in Modoc. We hear them tell us how they slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the ghost farm. The people of Modoc were convinced the slags were dangerous, and in human fashion, they were short-sighted and overzealous in the sight of a perceived threat. Fear can drive men to do horrible things if they believe their families and livelihoods are at stake. The men in town will speak of the horror and shame they feel after what they've done. The caravan drivers will speak about the atrocities these people have committed. They'll even say that the caravans are going to be pulling out of Modoc, as they no longer want to trade with such heartless, savage people. This is the evil option for resolving the conflict, back when player choice had massive effects on the world. We can convince a town to brutally murder another town. As a result, they live with the guilt, while being ostracized by the caravans, depriving them of the vital resources these caravans supply. The town will inevitably fail after this, even if they manage to use the crops from Ghost Farm. With no trade, they will not survive. Bullets, medicine, and supplies are just as important as food and water in the post-apocalypse. A town cannot survive without both. Alternatively, the player can give Vagar's message to the trader, Joe. He will not be convinced by the message alone. He is rightly suspicious of this strange group called the Slags, who have been living underground in a corpse-filled farm where their friend went missing. I mean, duh. He needs some assurances before accepting the Slags' offer. First, he needs to know what happened to their missing town member, Carl. Until now, Modoc was convinced that Carl was killed by the same people that strung up all those corpses. One of them might have even been Carl's. Joe demands an explanation for those murdered and the whereabouts of Carl. Luckily, the player can find a traumatized drunk in the den who matches the description. If the player travels to Mom's diner in the den, we can talk to Carl. He will tell us his backstory and erupt into tears. I do feel for Carl. The poor guy was just trying to farm for his town. We can convince him that the people of Modoc believe his story and want him to return home. Telling Joe we've met Carl in the den and that the bodies are fake will be enough to convince him. We are sent back to the Slags to finalize the peace agreement. In addition, we can now escort Johnny back to his parents. They thank us for rescuing their son and reward the player for our efforts. From Balthus, the player can receive a combat leather jacket. His father is the tanner, so rewarding us with a superior version of a leather jacket is a very believable and worthy reward. The combat leather armor is a fantastic piece of gear, especially early game. And since you can get this right off the bat, it's one of the best choices for a starting armor. The towns are at peace. The player helped broker a deal between two struggling communities. Now they can support each other. Perhaps this union will even grow into a large community similar to Shady Sands. The Slags can share their surplus food. Modoc can supply them with medicine and supplies via their caravan relations. I assume the Slags would share their effective irrigation knowledge with Modoc, ensuring that they both have enough crops for their communities to thrive. The butcher wouldn't need to slaughter all of his Brahmin now. He could go back to butchering a sustainable amount, while keeping the tanner well supplied with the leather. Johnny is returned safely to his family. No doubt his treatment while living with the Slags will only bolster the town's relationship even more. Future generations can live with each other in peace due to the player's actions. The good karma path for this town is very satisfying, and, I dare say, a wholesome progression of events. There are 2 more side quests to complete in this town before we wrap up. One is finding a Brahmin laying on its side. Poor Bess has broken her leg and cannot walk. If she continues in this state, she will surely die. The player can use their doctor skill to aid the Brahmin. If successful, she will rise to her feet, happy and healthy. If the player helps Bess, she will even follow us as a companion. She can even help the player defend the other Brahmin from the wolves. A small act of kindness for some positive karma and a fiercely loyal 2-headed cow. The other side quest is for Feral. He will ask the player to clear rats from his garden. We travel to his garden and kill a few rats. Very simple stuff. That concludes the story of Modoc and the Slags. An incredible town filled with interesting people and dynamic quests. The town's story is fleshed out through its amazing environmental storytelling. Weird goo randomly found throughout the town. If the player investigates, there is an answer for this. A missing boy? A BB gun in the well? If we investigate, there is a reason for this, and a resolution. A missing watch? Resolution. Ghost farm and a missing person? Resolution for this as well. The town is able to tell multiple stories about regular people surviving in the wastes, and pay each one of them off in a satisfying and immersive conclusion. But you might ask, what happened to Modoc after the events of Fallout 2? Well, as far as I have found, there are only 2 references to Modoc in future games, both found in Fallout New Vegas. First, in the mining community of Sloan, the player can meet one Jas Wilkins. She works in the mining community as a cook for the workers. Her great-aunt was Rose, the same Rose who ran the bed and breakfast in Modoc. Rose passed down the recipe for Deathclaw omelets to Jas. If the player brings her a Deathclaw egg from the nearby quarry, she can supply us with the very same Deathclaw omelets. It's a very nice callback to Fallout 2. In addition to this, the only other mention of Modoc is in a Crimson Caravan terminal entry. The only information gained from this is that there is a Crimson Caravan representative in the town of Modoc at the time of Fallout New Vegas. So from what the games tell us, Modoc prospered, at some point joining the new California Republic, and being a location big enough and populated enough to serve as some sort of hub for the Crimson Caravan. And that's it for Modoc. I hope through this exhaustive look at Modoc, you can see why it's my favorite small town in Fallout. The characters, the story, the care that was put in for all of the small details. It's a microcosm of all the early Fallout's best elements. Wonderful environmental storytelling, meaningful quests, thoughtful resolutions for each problem the town throws at you. If more towns in the coming Fallout 5 are crafted with the example of Modoc in mind, it would greatly improve the current state of Fallout's world building and immersion. The devs took time to create a story and show examples of how these people exist here, what they do, why they do it, and what they need to continue, giving the player choices to engage with this town and create meaningful and impactful results dependent on those choices. Modoc is the best of the best, and should be looked at as an example of a perfectly crafted town in Fallout. As the expectations of Fallout's writing and world design continue to plummet, we should look back on how much care and effort was put into the older towns. Going forward with more Fallout titles to come, Modoc should be seen as the standard for what a small town in a Fallout game can be. And with that, Wale, amicus.